The day I found out my husband didn't love me. He did it with a smile and a steak knife in his hand, carving brisket like he was hosting a cooking show, wearing the navy blazer I'd bought him for important nights, and laughing as if my humiliation was just another party trick. It was a fancy engagement party in Nashville, the kind with string lights draped like jewelry over a manicured backyard and a live trio playing soft jazz as if we were all starring in someone else's highlight reel. The hosts lived in Belmead. Their patio had a stone fireplace that probably cost more than my first car. Everyone kept calling it intimate, which is what people say when they want you to notice the money without admitting they want you to notice the money. I'd come straight from Vanderbilt after a brutal shift. Not still in scrubs, but close, hair twisted up, lipstick I'd put on in my car, the faint smell of hospital soap that never fully leaves your hands. Jason had teased me earlier, kissing my cheek and saying, "Babe, you're always saving lives. Tonight, just smile. Let me do the talking." Let me do the talking. That should have been my first warning of the night. But I'd learned over years that Jason's confidence always sounded most convincing right before it cracked. We were seated at a long table near the grill station, surrounded by people we called friends because we didn't have a better word for the couples we keep seeing at dinners. Jason was in his element, arms slung along the back of my chair like I was a trophy, like I belonged to his story. He clinked his glass and stood, already grinning, already ready to be adored. Someone had asked how we met. Someone always asked. They loved the origin story because it gave them something neat and romantic to file away under good people. Jason launched into his version, how I'd been so serious, how he'd had to soften me up, how I'd been all textbooks and no fun. The table laughed on cue. I smiled because smiling is the easiest mask. Then his voice shifted. It got louder, looser. That particular swagger men get when they think the room is theirs. He nodded toward me, the grin widening as if he were about to compliment me. Instead, he said, "Honestly, I married her because I felt sorry for her. Nobody else wanted her." For a half second, the night didn't make sense. The words hung above the table like smoke that refused to rise. I saw mouths open into laughter, saw shoulders shake, saw someone slap the table hard enough to rattle silverware. One of the women actually wheezed, clutching her chest like Jason had delivered the funniest line she'd heard all year. The sound came at me in waves, bright, careless, loud. It didn't feel real. It felt like standing in an ER when a trauma alarm goes off and everyone moves and talks and shouts while something inside you goes perfectly still. I looked at Jason. He was watching the reaction, soaking it in. He wasn't watching me. He didn't even glance down to see if I was okay. He didn't soften it with, "I'm kidding." He didn't reach for my hand under the table. He didn't try to catch my eyes. He just basked in the laughter like it was applause meant for him. My face stayed composed out of pure training. Years of delivering bad news had taught me how to keep my voice steady even when the world was turning. I could tell a mother her child didn't make it and still sound like a professional. I could hold pressure on an artery with one hand while telling a panicked father to breathe. I could keep calm when chaos was screaming in my ear. So I didn't flinch. But something inside me changed temperature. I felt it as clearly as a pulse. A click, like a switch being turned from warm to cold. The table kept laughing. Someone said, "Jason, you're terrible," in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. Another man lifted his drink and said, "To honesty." They cheered, glasses clinking. And I realized in that exact moment that the room wasn't laughing with him. They were laughing at me. I took a slow breath. I set my napkin down with deliberate care, the way I set instruments down after a procedure. I turned my head toward Jason, still smiling his wide, practiced smile, and I gave him a small look, pleasant, polite, harmless. The kind of look that tells a man he's winning. He finally looked at me then briefly, like checking the dashboard. His eyes said, "See? Everyone loves me. Be cool." I stood. "My feet are killing me," I said lightly, as if I'd just remembered I was wearing heels. "I'm going to step inside for a second." No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. A few people nodded, already drifting back into their conversations. Jason didn't move to follow. He simply turned back to the table, still holding court, still feeding himself on attention. I walked across the patio without rushing. I made myself move at an easy pace. I passed the buffet, the dessert display, the champagne tower that someone had already taken too many photos of. The music floated behind me. The laughter did too. Inside the house, the air was cooler, quieter. The kitchen was spotless, staged for guests the way some people stage their lives. I moved to the hallway bathroom and closed the door. For a moment, I just stood there with my hands on the sink, staring at my reflection like I was assessing a patient. My eyes were steady. My mouth was still in a neutral line. I didn't look devastated. That almost scared me more than the joke. I turned the faucet on, letting water run over my fingers, and I listened to my own breathing. Shock didn't arrive as tears. It arrived as clarity. Jason had said the quiet part out loud, and the room had confirmed it. Not one person had looked uncomfortable enough to stop laughing. Not one person had tried to rescue me from it. They had all accepted the premise that I was the lucky one, the charity case, the woman someone married out of pity. The injustice didn't make me scream. It made my spine straighten. In the mirror, I saw the exact moment my softness left the room. I dried my hands, smoothed my hair, and reapplied lipstick with slow precision. Then I opened the door and stepped back into the party like nothing had happened. Because I wasn't going to ruin his night. Not yet. I walked toward the lights and the laughter, toward the husband who just turned my marriage into a punchline, and I smiled the way I smiled at difficult patients, calm, courteous, and already planning what came next. I rejoined the table with the same calm face I used when a trauma bay filled up and everyone looked at me like I was the only adult in the room. Jason was still talking, still shining, still chewing up attention like it was protein. He didn't lower his voice when I sat back down. He didn't touch my shoulder. He didn't even pause to check whether I'd heard him, because of course I had. He assumed I'd take it the way I always took things. Quietly, politely, with the patience of a woman trained to keep other people alive. And that assumption, his comfort inside my silence, was the part that made my chest feel oddly hollow. Someone slid me a glass of wine, as if alcohol was a bandage. "You okay, Em?" a woman asked, but her eyes were already moving past me, like she was scanning for the next fun moment. "I'm fine," I said, and the word landed clean. No tremor. No break. Because I was fine. Not emotionally, not in the way people mean it, but fine in the way a surgeon is fine right before a cut. Focused, contained, precise. They kept eating, kept laughing. Jason kept telling stories where he was always the hero, and I was always the supporting character, the hardworking wife who made his life possible. He didn't say it like gratitude. He said it like entitlement. I watched him, and something cold and practical began lining itself up inside my brain, like instruments on a tray. When the party finally loosened, when couples drifted toward the fire pit and the trio switched to something slower, I excused myself again. This time, I didn't go inside. I slipped to the edge of the yard where the light didn't reach as brightly. The grass was still damp from afternoon watering. Somewhere nearby, someone's laughter rose and felt like it mattered. My phone buzzed with a hospital group chat I had muted, an update about staffing for the morning shift. Even off duty, the ER lived inside me. People think emergency medicine is all adrenaline, all chaos, all heroic saves. Most of it is control. It's steady hands and steady voice. It's making decisions when someone else is screaming. It's knowing that panic is contagious, and if I catch it, everyone else does too. I'd built my entire life around not catching panic. At 31, I'd learned how to stand in the worst moments of other people's lives without falling into them. I'd learned how to read faces, how to hear what wasn't being said, how to trace a problem to its source instead of getting lost in noise. And now, standing at the edge of a picture-perfect engagement party, I realized I'd been applying those skills to everyone except myself. Jason had always been the one situation I treated like a chronic condition. Monitor, manage, adjust. Don't overreact. Hope it improves. Hope. I pressed my fingers into the pocket of my dress until they closed around metal. A small silver compass charm, worn soft at the edges, familiar as a heartbeat. I carried it the way some people carried a cross. Not because I was especially spiritual, but because it was my one private ritual, my one secret anchor. It had belonged to my grandpa, a man who smelled like cedar and black coffee and never wasted words. When I was a kid, he'd take me fishing in East Tennessee and let me hold that compass in my palm like it was a treasure. Directions matter, he'd tell me, turning it so the needle settled. But what matters more is knowing when you've been let off course. He died halfway through my first year of med school. I'd been on a call schedule. I'd missed the last conversation I could have had with him because I'd been in a lab, thinking there would always be more time. At the funeral, my grandmother pressed the compass charm into my hand and said, "He wanted you to have it. He said you'd need it when you were making decisions that scared you." For years, I only touched it when I was lost in the ordinary ways, choosing a specialty, deciding where to do residency, signing my first contract at Vanderbilt. But I'd never touched it like this. Tonight, the metal felt colder than usual, like it had been waiting. Behind me, Jason's voice rose in laughter again. A sound too easy, too careless. The sound of a man who believed he could say anything in public and still go home with the benefits of my life. He thought my composure meant acceptance. He thought my calm meant weakness. I rolled the charm between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the tiny grooves, the weight of it. The compass didn't point anywhere new. North was still north. But my direction changed anyway. Because the truth settled into place with the same certainty as that needle, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't wondering if I'd imagined it. I wasn't bargaining with myself, telling myself he didn't mean it, telling myself it was just a joke. Jason meant it. And I suddenly knew, with startling clarity, that I couldn't unhear it. I couldn't unsee the way everyone laughed. I couldn't go back to the version of me that tried to make his disrespect survivable. A breeze moved through the yard, lifting the ends of my hair. I could smell smoke from the fire pit, char from the grill, expensive cologne and sweet cocktails. A staged night. A staged marriage. I slipped the compass charm back into my pocket and straightened my shoulders. No tears. Not here. Not because it didn't hurt. Because hurt was a luxury I could indulge later, in private, when it wouldn't distract me from what mattered. I walked back toward the light with my face composed and my mind quietly shifting into a different mode, the same mode I used when a patient came in with symptoms that didn't add up. The same mode that didn't care about excuses. The mode that asked only one question. What's really going on? Jason turned as I approached, flashing that charming grin, and draped an arm around my waist like a man who believed the story was still his to control. I leaned in close enough for him to smell my perfume and said softly, "Having fun?" He laughed. "Always. You good?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and smiled the way I smiled when a patient told me they were fine but their vitals said otherwise. "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." And I meant it in the only way that mattered. Because when a woman like me finally decides she's done being lost, she doesn't announce it. She finds her direction. And she starts walking. If you had asked our friends what kind of couple we were, they would have said we were balanced. That was the polite word people used when one person carried the entire structure and the other person decorated it. Jason liked to tell people we were a team. He loved that word. It sounded modern. Equal. Like two ambitious adults building a future together. The truth was much simpler. For 5 years, I paid for almost everything. The mortgage on our house in East Nashville. The utilities. The groceries. The insurance. The vacations Jason insisted were important for networking. The dinners with his friends where he talked about business ideas that never quite became businesses. I even paid for the navy blazer he wore to the engagement party the night he joked about marrying me out of pity. And every time the topic came up, usually because someone asked what Jason was doing these days, he had a story ready. He was always almost there. Finishing a certification. Launching something with a buddy. Talking to investors. Waiting for the right role. There was always a next step just over the horizon. Always something that explained why he wasn't earning money yet, but definitely would soon. I wanted to believe him. Not because I was naive. I wasn't. Emergency medicine burns naivete out of you in the first year. You learn very quickly that hope without evidence is just another form of denial. But marriage changes the way you process information. When you love someone, you start editing the story in real time. You smooth out the inconsistencies. You give them more patience than you'd ever give a stranger. Jason had ambition. That part was real. He talked about ideas constantly, consulting work, sports analytics startups, online courses, market predictions. His brain ran fast and loud, full of plans and strategies. Execution was the problem. Every plan needed funding. Every opportunity required a little runway. Every certification cost money. Just for a few months, he would say. Or, this one actually matters. Or, my personal favorite, you're investing in us. The first time I transferred money to him, we'd only been married 6 months. It was small. A few $100s for an online course he said would open doors. He was excited about it in that contagious way he had when he thought he was about to become someone important. 3 months later, I asked how the course was going. "Oh yeah," he said casually, like he'd forgotten the question existed. It wasn't really what they advertised. That was the end of that. The second time was bigger. A certification program, connected to some consulting work a friend had mentioned. "Once I finish this," he told me over dinner, leaning forward like he was pitching investors, "I'll be bringing in real money." I remember the way he said real money, as if the money paying for the dinner didn't count. I wrote the check anyway. Months passed. The certification never quite finished. Something about scheduling issues. Something about the market shifting. Something about the opportunity not being as strong as expected. There was always a reason. By the second year of our marriage, the pattern was so familiar, it almost felt normal. Jason chased potential. I paid the bills. When people asked about our finances, he joked about it openly. "Emily's the genius," he'd say, clinking glasses with other husbands. I married up. Everyone laughed like it was charming humility. But there was always something just under the joke. Something that made his smile a little sharper. Because the more stable my career became, the more unpredictable his path looked in comparison. By the time I turned 30, I was an attending physician in the ER at Vanderbilt Medical Center. My schedule was brutal, but my life had structure. Paychecks arrived on time. Promotions came through measurable work. Progress had a rhythm. Jason's life ran on possibility. And possibility is intoxicating until you realize it never actually turns into anything. Still, I tried to be supportive. I told myself entrepreneurship was messy. I told myself success stories always sounded chaotic in the early chapters. I told myself my job was to believe in him while he figured it out. So, I kept paying the mortgage, kept covering dinners, kept booking flights when he said conferences were important connections. Sometimes, late at night after a shift, I'd come home to find Jason sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open and 3 tabs full of charts or sports statistics or business articles. He'd look up, energized. "Babe, listen to this idea." And I would listen, even when I was exhausted, even when my scrub still smelled like antiseptic and adrenaline. Because that's what wives do when they think they're building a future with someone. What I didn't realize was that Jason had quietly rewritten the meaning of the word team. In his version, a team meant one person earning the money, and the other person spending it. At the time, I told myself it was temporary. Temporary support. Temporary imbalance. Temporary investment in a man who just needed one break to prove everyone wrong. But standing at that engagement party in Nashville, hearing him laugh about marrying me out of pity, something in my memory started replaying the last 5 years differently. Not as patience. Not as partnership. But as a long, expensive illusion I had been financing one transfer at a time. Looking back, the warning signs weren't dramatic. There were no screaming fights. No shattered glasses. No slammed doors. Just small moments that felt slightly off. The kind of things you brush aside when you're tired and your life already runs at emergency room speed. Jason was very good at making problems feel small. especially when I was exhausted. My schedule at Vanderbilt could be brutal. 24-hour shifts weren't common anymore, but they still happened when staffing got thin. On those days, the hospital became its own universe. Bright lights, monitors beeping, trauma alarms echoing down hallways. Time worked differently there. You walked in when the sun was up and walked out when the world had moved forward without you. Those were the days when coming home felt like reaching the surface after being underwater. But Jason had a strange habit of treating those days like opportunities. The first time it happened, I walked into the house at 9 in the morning after a shift that had included a motorcycle crash, a pediatric seizure, and a man who'd been stabbed outside a bar. My head felt heavy. My body moved like it belonged to someone else. When I opened the door, music was playing. Loud music. There were 3 men sitting in the living room with Jason, beers open, laptops out, something about sports statistics on the television. Jason looked up and grinned like he'd just been caught doing something fun. Perfect timing. I blinked at him. What's going on? Just the guys, he said casually. We were talking about a betting model. One of the men lifted a beer toward me. Dr. Carter, he said, smiling like we'd met before. Maybe we had. Jason rotated friends through the house like guests in a lounge. I just got off a 24-hour shift, I said slowly. Jason waved a hand like I'd mentioned the weather. Yeah. Go get some sleep. He said it kindly enough. But he didn't lower the music. He didn't ask his friends to leave. He didn't even look particularly concerned. I went upstairs and shut the bedroom door. The bass from the speakers vibrated faintly through the floor. At the time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Jason worked from home, or at least that's how he described it, so it made sense that he'd have people over during the day. Still, the pattern repeated. I'd come home from a brutal shift and find strangers in the kitchen, or friends on the patio, or Jason hosting what he called strategy nights. Sometimes they ordered expensive takeout. Sometimes they drank until midnight while I tried to sleep down the hall before another shift. Whenever I mentioned it, Jason turned it into a joke. Come on, Em, he'd say, smiling that disarming smile. You save lives for a living. Let us mortals have some fun. Everyone laughed. And suddenly, I was the serious one. The rigid one. The wife who couldn't relax. The second red flag was money. Not huge amounts. That would have triggered alarms immediately. Jason always asked for small things. Hey, could you spot me 200? My card's acting weird. Or, I need to cover this course fee today. I'll transfer it back next week. Or, can you handle dinner tonight? I got something tied up with a payment. Individually, the requests sounded harmless. Together, they formed a quiet drip. 200 here, 300 there, 500 for a conference deposit. Sometimes he paid a little back. Sometimes he didn't. If I asked about it later, he'd wave it away. Babe, we're married. Why are you tracking nickels and dimes? Nickels and dimes. I made a physician's salary, yes. But I also carried medical school loans and a mortgage, and a job that didn't exactly leave room for careless spending. Jason, meanwhile, treated money like oxygen. Something that would always be there. The third red flag was the way he talked about my work. Not directly. Never cruelly enough to start a real fight. Just little comments. When I fell asleep on the couch after a shift. Rough day saving the world. When I declined a dinner invitation because I had a shift at 6 a.m. Guess the hospital owns you again. When friends praised my career, Jason would smile and say, yeah, but someone has to keep her from becoming a robot. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. Because that's what you do when a joke lands slightly wrong but everyone else seems comfortable with it. But slowly, almost invisibly, Jason turned my exhaustion into entertainment. The hardworking wife. The overly serious doctor. The woman who needed him to balance her out. At the time, I believed that narrative. I thought we complemented each other. I thought my stability gave him space to dream. What I didn't see was something much simpler. Jason wasn't balancing my life. He was building his on top of it. And every time I ignored one of those quiet red flags, I made it easier for him to keep going. The first real crack didn't come from Jason. It came from my phone. I was halfway through a shift at Vanderbilt, standing in the ER hallway with a tablet in one hand and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. It had already been a chaotic morning. 2 car accidents, 1 stroke alert, and a kid with a broken arm screaming loud enough to shake the waiting room. Chaos like that usually sharpened my focus. But when my phone buzzed in my pocket, something about the alert made me glance down immediately. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. For a moment, the words didn't register. Insufficient funds? That wasn't possible. My checking account was where my paycheck landed. It covered the mortgage, utilities, groceries, everything that kept our life running. I kept a buffer there precisely so things like this wouldn't happen. I stepped into an empty supply room and opened the banking app. The balance stared back at me. Too low. Not empty, but far lower than it should have been. My first reaction wasn't panic. It was confusion. I started scrolling through the transaction list. And that's when the pattern appeared. Withdrawals. Transfers. Online purchases. Some were small, $120 here, $85 there. Others were bigger. $600 transferred out 3 days ago. $450 in purchases at a sporting goods site. $300 withdrawn in cash. None of it looked familiar. I stood there for a long moment while the fluorescent lights hummed above me. My mind moved the way it did when I examined a patient chart that didn't match the symptoms. Carefully, methodically, I checked the timestamps. Most of the transactions happened late at night, or in the middle of the afternoon while I was working, which meant there were only 2 possible explanations. Fraud. Or Jason. I closed the app and slipped the phone back in my pocket just as a nurse knocked on the supply room door. Emily, we need you in trauma too. I nodded and walked out. For the next 3 hours, I did my job like nothing had happened. I stabilized a man with internal bleeding. I reassured a terrified mother that her daughter's concussion wasn't life-threatening. I wrote discharge notes and reviewed scans and gave instructions that people would either follow carefully or forget the moment they left. The whole time, the numbers in my head kept rearranging themselves. I didn't confront Jason right away. Not because I was afraid. Because I wanted to see how he'd explain it. When my shift finally ended that evening, the sky over Nashville had already turned that soft purple color that comes just before dark. Jason was in the kitchen when I got home, leaning against the counter and scrolling on his phone. He looked relaxed, comfortable. "Hey, babe," he said, barely glancing up. "How was the war zone today?" I set my bag down slowly. "Jason," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Did you use my debit card recently?" He didn't even look surprised. He just shrugged. "Yeah, a few times." I waited. He didn't elaborate. "So," I said carefully, "you withdrew money from the account." "Relax," he said, finally looking up. "I needed it for something." Something. I studied his face. No guilt. No hesitation. Just mild annoyance that I'd brought it up. "How much?" I asked. Jason leaned back against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "I don't know. A couple thousand maybe." The number hit harder than the casual way he said it. "A couple thousand?" I repeated. He said, sighing like I was the difficult one. "You act like I robbed a bank." "That's not the point. I'll pay it back." The words came out instantly like a reflex. "When?" I asked. "Soon." Soon. The same word he used for certifications, startups, consulting contracts, and every other plan that hovered just out of reach. "You could have told me," I said. Jason rolled his eyes. "We're married. It's not a crime." He walked past me, opening the fridge like the conversation had already ended. "Besides," he added casually, "you make plenty." That sentence sat in the air between us. Not angry. Not defensive. Just factual in his mind. I watched him grab a beer and twist the cap off. A year ago, I might have argued. I might have explained budgets, respect, partnership. I might have tried to make him understand why this mattered. But something about the way he said it, so comfortable, so certain the money was automatically his, stopped me. Because arguing wouldn't change anything. Jason didn't see a problem. And when someone doesn't see a problem, they don't change their behavior. So instead of arguing, I nodded. Okay, I said quietly. Jason looked almost relieved. See, he said with a grin. Not a big deal. He walked into the living room and turned on the TV. The conversation was over for him, but for me, it had just begun. Later that night, after Jason fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I downloaded the last 6 months of bank statements. Then I started a new folder. I named it something simple. Financial records. Inside it, I created subfolders. Transactions. Transfers. Receipts. Notes. I copied screenshots. Saved timestamps. Highlighted withdrawals. Jason thought the problem was that he hadn't asked. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that something about the numbers didn't feel random. And when something doesn't add up, I don't stop looking until it does. The confirmation came 3 weeks later. Not through a bank statement. Not through a confession. But through timing. Timing is everything in emergency medicine. People think diagnosis is about intelligence or intuition, but most of the time it's about noticing when something doesn't match the timeline it's supposed to follow. And Jason's timeline had started slipping. He'd been out more often. Not late-night partying, nothing obvious enough to start an argument. Just stretches of time where he said he was working with guys or running numbers. The house felt busier too. More visitors. More voices in the den. More nights where I came home to the smell of takeout and the glow of the television behind a half-closed door. Jason always said the same thing when I asked. Just the guys. 3 words that covered everything and explained nothing. The night everything clicked into place started like any other shift day. I'd been scheduled until midnight. But around 9:30, the ER slowed down unexpectedly. No incoming trauma. No waiting patients. My replacement arrived early, and for once the charge nurse looked at me and said something I almost never heard. Go home. I didn't argue. Driving through Nashville that late always felt strange. The city was quieter, the streets reflecting neon and traffic lights in long streaks across the pavement. By 10:15, I was pulling into our driveway. Jason's car was there. So, was another one I didn't recognize. And a third. I sat for a moment with the engine still running. 3 cars. Jason hadn't mentioned having people over. Not that he usually did. But tonight something about it felt deliberate. The house lights were on. I walked up the front steps and opened the door quietly. Voices drifted down the hallway. Not loud. Focused. The den door was closed most of the way, and a blue glow from the television spilled through the gap. Jason's voice was inside. So that's a lock, he was saying confidently. Someone else laughed. I stepped closer without making a sound. Through the small opening, I could see the room. 3 men sat around the coffee table. Jason leaned forward in an armchair, a legal pad balanced on his knee. The television showed multiple screens, sports games, betting lines, odds shifting in real time. One of the men held a stack of cash. Actual cash. Loose bills folded together with rubber bands. Another man sat slightly apart from the others, quiet, watchful. He didn't look like Jason's usual friends. Jason tapped his pen against the paper. Trust me, he said. This one's a lock. The man with the cash smirked. Locks don't exist, he replied. Tonight they do, Jason said. The quiet man finally spoke. His voice was calm. You covering the difference if it doesn't hit? Jason hesitated. Only for a second. Yeah, he said quickly. Yeah, of course. How? Jason shrugged. I'll settle it. With what? Jason laughed lightly. My wife gets paid Friday. The room chuckled. Something in my chest went perfectly still. Not because Jason was betting. I already suspected that. But because of the way the quiet man watched him. Evaluating. Measuring. Like someone who wasn't there for entertainment. Then the man leaned forward slightly. You said that last week. Jason's smile tightened. It's coming. The man nodded once. Not convinced. Just patient. And suddenly I understood something with sharp clarity. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't another guy running predictions. He was a runner. Someone collecting money for someone else. Jason wasn't just playing around with sports statistics. He was gambling. With money he didn't have. With money that wasn't his. And he was using my paycheck as collateral. My hand slowly tightened around the doorframe. For a brief moment, anger flared hot enough to push me inside the room. To demand explanations. To end the lie right there. But the feeling passed quickly. Because walking in would only give Jason a chance to talk.
To spin.
To minimize. Instead, I stepped backward.
Quietly. Carefully.
I walked out the front door again, without making a sound. The cool night air hit my face as I crossed the driveway. I got into my car and closed the door. Only then did I allow myself to breathe out. The house lights glowed through the windshield. Inside, Jason was still laughing with his new associates. Still promising money that technically belonged to me. Still believing I was the safest blind spot in his life. I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar shape of the silver compass charm. The metal was cold against my fingers. For a long moment, I stared at the house. Then I said the words out loud, quietly, just to hear them exist. I'm done. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just a decision. Because the worst part of betrayal isn't discovering the lie. It's realizing how long someone has relied on you not noticing it. Jason thought he was running a secret life right under my nose. But he'd forgotten something important.
I was trained to notice patterns.
And now that I'd finally seen the whole picture, I wasn't going to be the blind spot anymore. Once you stop arguing, people get comfortable. Jason certainly did. After the night I saw the betting setup in the den, I didn't confront him. I didn't bring it up the next morning. I didn't ask about the men in our house or the cash on the coffee table. Instead, I behaved exactly the way he expected me to.
Busy.
Tired. Distracted by work. Jason mistook silence for ignorance. That mistake became my advantage. In emergency medicine, documentation is everything. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. That rule exists because memory is unreliable and people lie when pressure rises. So, I treated my own marriage the way I'd treat a complicated case. I started building a file. Not on my work computer. Not anywhere Jason might casually scroll past. A private, encrypted drive. Inside it, a folder with a simple name. Records. Then I began collecting everything. Screenshots of bank statements. Copies of transfers. Photos of the legal pad Jason left in the den after betting nights, covered in numbers and team names, and the word lock scribbled next to certain games. I documented every time he asked for money. Every text message. Every temporary expense. The requests became strangely predictable once I started tracking them. They usually arrived late afternoon, right before dinner. Hey babe, quick favor?
Or,
can you float me a little cash until Friday? Or, my personal favorite. My card's acting weird again. The amount stayed just small enough to avoid raising alarms. 200. 300. Sometimes 5. Each time, I saved the message. Each time, I recorded the transfer. At first the process felt clinical. Detached. Like organizing patient charts. But after 2 weeks, a pattern started emerging. Jason wasn't just spending randomly. He was cycling money. Withdrawals would appear right before the nights his friends came over. Then new transfers would show up the following day. Sometimes from people I didn't know. Sometimes from accounts with names that looked suspiciously like temporary payment apps. I didn't confront him. I just kept building the file. The real shock came on a Tuesday night while I was reviewing my credit report. It wasn't something I checked often, but after the bank account situation, I decided to run a full financial overview. Most of it looked normal. Mortgage. Student loans. One credit card I used for daily spending. Then I saw something I didn't recognize. A store credit line. $600. Opened 4 months earlier. My name. My social security number. My address. I stared at the screen. I had never applied for it. My first thought was identity theft. But identity thieves usually go big. Expensive electronics. Massive credit limits. This wasn't that. The account showed small purchases. A pair of sneakers. A gaming headset. A jacket. Payments had been made on time. Just enough to keep the account active. Just enough to avoid suspicion. My stomach tightened. because suddenly the pattern made sense. Jason hadn't started with large fraud. He'd started with something small.
Testing.
Seeing how far he could go without triggering alarms. Opening credit lines in my name. Using them carefully. Building a quiet safety net of money that technically wasn't his. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Then I opened a new folder inside the evidence drive. Credit activity. I downloaded the full report. Saved the account details. Screenshotted the application information. The IP address listed for the sign-up location. Our home network. Jason had done it sitting in the same house where I slept. That realization should have made me furious. Instead, it made me very calm. Because this wasn't just irresponsible anymore. It wasn't even just betrayal. It was fraud. And fraud leaves trails. I spent the next hour checking for more accounts.
2 others appeared.
Both small. Both recent. Both opened using my identity. Jason hadn't gone big because he didn't want to trigger alerts.
He was experimenting.
Testing the boundaries of how much he could extract from my life without me noticing. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the arrogance. The quiet certainty that I would never check. That I was too busy saving strangers in the ER to notice what was happening in my own house. I closed the laptop slowly. Across the living room, Jason sat on the couch watching sports highlights, completely relaxed. "Hey," he said casually. "Did you see that last play?" I looked at him. Really looked. The same man who joked about marrying me out of pity. The same man who promised gambling money using my paycheck. The same man quietly opening credit lines in my name. Jason smiled like nothing in the world was wrong. And that's when I realized something important. He thought the game was still his. He thought he was the only one keeping secrets. I slipped the laptop shut and picked up my phone. Another screenshot. Another entry for the vault. Jason had been testing how far he could go. What he didn't realize was that I had stopped being the victim in his experiment. Now, I was the one collecting data. And every new piece of evidence brought me closer to the moment when he would finally understand something he had never considered before. The calmest person in the room is usually the one preparing the outcome. By the time the next piece of the puzzle appeared, I already knew Jason was lying. I just didn't know how far he'd gone. Living with someone while secretly documenting them creates a strange kind of double life. On the surface, everything looked the same. We still had dinner together. We still talked about work. Jason still kissed my cheek when I left for early shifts. But underneath that routine, I was watching everything. Listening differently. Noticing details that used to slide past me. And Jason kept behaving exactly the way someone behaves when they think the person next to them isn't paying attention. 2 weeks after discovering the credit lines, I came home earlier than expected again. Not because of a slow shift this time. Because I forgot my laptop. It was a small mistake. I'd left it on the kitchen counter that morning and realized halfway to the hospital that I needed it for chart reviews later that night. So I turned around. When I pulled into the driveway, Jason's car was there. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way his voice carried through the open kitchen window as I walked toward the front door. He was on the phone. And he sounded tense. "I told you it's handled," Jason said. I paused. Not intentionally. Just long enough for the next sentence to reach me. "You'll have the 3,000. 3,000. My hand hovered near the door handle. The voice on the other end of the call was too faint to understand, but Jason responded quickly. "Friday," he said. A pause. Then he laughed in that slightly forced way he used when he was trying to sound confident. "Relax. My wife gets paid Friday." My chest tightened. Again. Always Friday. Always my paycheck. The same phrase I'd heard weeks earlier in the den. The man on the other end said something sharper this time. Even from outside, I could hear the tone shift. Jason's voice dropped lower.
No.
"Listen, I've got it covered." Another pause. Then Jason said something that made my fingers go cold. "I already handled the loan."
Loan.
I pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. Jason stood in the kitchen with his back partially turned toward me, one hand pressed against the counter as he spoke into the phone.
"Yeah," he said.
"Approved yesterday." He listened for a moment. "Of course it's legit," he added quickly. Everything checks out. My pulse slowed, not sped up.
Slowed.
Because when you hear something that confirms your worst suspicion, panic disappears. What replaces it is a strange kind of precision. Jason ended the call just as he turned and saw me standing there. His expression flickered. Only briefly. "Hey," he said, forcing a smile. "You're home early." "I forgot my laptop," I replied calmly. He nodded, already moving toward the fridge like nothing had happened. I walked past him, picked up the laptop from the counter, and slipped it into my bag. Neither of us mentioned the phone call. But that night, after Jason fell asleep, I opened my computer and checked my email. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. But there it was, buried between hospital newsletters and billing notifications. Subject line: Loan approval confirmation. My name. My address. A personal loan for $3,000. Approved that morning. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. Then I opened the full application details. Every field was filled out correctly. My personal information. My employment details.
My salary.
Everything accurate. Except for one small problem. The application timestamp. 2:14 p.m. I checked my hospital badge logs. At 2:14 p.m. that day, I had scanned into the trauma wing to treat a patient, which meant something very simple. The loan application had been submitted from our home internet connection, while I was physically inside Vanderbilt Medical Center. Jason hadn't just borrowed money. He had taken out a loan in my name. A loan he planned to use to cover his gambling debt. I downloaded the entire approval email, saved the IP address, captured the timestamp, added everything to the evidence vault. Then I sat there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the dark window over the sink. Somewhere upstairs, Jason slept peacefully. He believed the system still worked, that I would discover the loan eventually, that I would get angry, that we would argue, and that somehow, like every other time, the problem would fade into the background of our marriage. What Jason didn't understand was that the moment he crossed into fraud, the situation changed. This wasn't a marriage problem anymore. It was a legal one. And legal problems have consequences that don't disappear with apologies. I closed the laptop slowly and slipped the silver compass charm between my fingers. The metal felt steady, certain. For weeks, I had been collecting pieces of the truth. But now I finally had the one thing that mattered most. Proof. Not suspicion. Not patterns. Proof that Jason had committed fraud using my identity while I was physically at work. Which meant when the time came, the story wouldn't be his to spin anymore. The invitation came 3 days later. Jason tossed it onto the kitchen counter, like it was something I should be excited about. "Dinner Thursday," he said, opening a sparkling water. "Important one." I glanced down at the message on his phone screen. A rooftop lounge in the Gulch. One of those places with glass railings, expensive cocktails, and a view of Nashville that made people feel more successful than they actually were. Our usual group would be there. Jason's friends. Their wives. The same crowd that laughed the night he said he married me out of pity. I picked up the phone and read the details. Celebrating Mark's promotion, Jason added casually. "Good networking night." Networking. That word again. I set the phone down slowly. "Sure," I said. Jason smiled, satisfied.
"Great."
And, try not to be in work mode all night, okay? I looked at him. "What does that mean?" He smirked lightly. "You know, relax. Don't interrogate people about their life choices." I almost laughed, but instead I simply nodded. Of course. Because by then everything was already prepared. The fraud evidence, the credit lines, the bank statements, the loan application, the IP records, and the letter from my attorney. I had printed everything that afternoon, neatly organized, clipped together inside a thick envelope. The last page sat at the very back. 2 documents. One from the bank's fraud department confirming they had opened a formal investigation into unauthorized financial activity under my identity. The other was a demand letter. Jason Miller's name printed cleanly across the top. Thursday night arrived warm and clear. The rooftop lounge was exactly the kind of place Jason loved. Soft lighting, polished concrete floors, Music just loud enough to make people lean closer to talk. Our group occupied a long table near the railing. Everyone looked relaxed. Drinks already half empty. Jason wrapped an arm around my shoulders as we approached. "There she is," he said loudly. "The hardest working woman in Nashville." A few people clapped lightly. Someone handed me a drink. Someone else joked about doctors making real money. I sat down quietly.
Watched.
Listened. Jason was in rare form that night. Confident.
Loose.
Performing. He told stories about business ideas and betting predictions, and how exhausting it was being married to someone so serious. The group laughed easily. And then, halfway through dinner, one of the guys nudged him. "So, Jason," he said, grinning, "remind everyone why Emily married you again." The table chuckled. Jason leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with the setup. "Oh no," someone laughed. "Here we go." Jason raised his glass. "You want the honest answer?" he said. The group leaned in. Jason pointed his thumb toward me. "I married her because I felt sorry for her." Laughter exploded around the table. Again, the same joke. The same roomful of people ready to laugh. Jason shook his head dramatically. "Seriously," he continued, grinning. "Nobody else wanted her. I figured someone had to step up." More laughter. Someone slapped the table. Someone else wiped tears from their eyes. This time, I didn't excuse myself. I simply reached down beside my chair and placed the envelope on the table. The thick stack of papers landed with a quiet but unmistakable weight. The laughter slowed. Jason glanced at it. "What's that?" he asked casually. I slid the envelope toward the center of the table. "Evidence," I said. The word cut through the noise. People exchanged confused looks. Jason laughed uncertainly. "Okay," he said. "Evidence of what?" "Everything." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first set of documents. Bank statements. Highlighted withdrawals. Transfers.
Dates. Amounts.
Jason's smile faded slightly. Then came the credit line records. Accounts opened in my name. Purchases. Payment histories. Someone at the table leaned closer. Jason shifted in his seat. "Emily," he muttered quietly. "What are you doing?" I ignored him. Next came the loan approval. $3,000. My name. My information. Submitted from our home IP address. While I was clocked into the hospital, the table had gone silent now. Jason's face had lost its color. "This is ridiculous," he said quickly. I placed the final page on top of the stack. 2 letters. One from the bank's fraud investigation unit. One from my attorney. The words "formal investigation" were clearly visible.
So was Jason's full name.
No one laughed anymore. Jason stared at the papers like they might disappear if he didn't blink. "What the hell is this?" he snapped. I leaned back in my chair calmly. "You've been gambling," I said evenly. Silence. "You've been stealing from our accounts." More silence. "You opened credit lines in my name." Jason's jaw tightened. "And," I finished tapping the final document, "you committed loan fraud using my identity while I was at work." Someone across the table whispered, "Jesus." Jason suddenly stood up. "This is insane," he barked. I met his eyes. Then I repeated his words back to him. Slowly. Calmly. "I only stayed out of pity," I said. The table froze. Jason's face twisted. "What?" I held his gaze. "Nobody else should have to deal with you." The sentence landed heavier than anything else that night. Jason opened his mouth to argue. But no one at the table was laughing anymore. And for the first time since the backyard party, Jason Miller looked exactly like what he was. Not charming. Not funny. Just a man realizing the audience had finally seen the whole story. The ride home was silent. Jason didn't speak in the elevator. Didn't look at me in the parking garage. Didn't say a single word during the drive. The performance mask he wore around other people had cracked, and underneath it was something I had never seen before.
Panic.
The moment we stepped inside the house, it finally came out. "What the hell was that?" he snapped, slamming the door behind him. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and removed my heels with slow, deliberate movements. "That," I said calmly, "was the truth." Jason laughed sharply. You humiliated me. I looked at him. You did that yourself. His face tightened. You think you're going to destroy my life over some stupid paperwork? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. Jason noticed the movement. What are you doing? Recording, I said simply. His expression changed instantly. Are you serious right now? You just threatened me. I replied evenly. I'd like a record of whatever comes next. Jason took a step toward me. For a moment, I thought he might try to grab the phone. Instead, he stopped and ran a hand through his hair, pacing like a trapped animal. This is insane, he muttered. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Identity fraud isn't a proportion problem, I said. You're my wife. And you used my identity. Jason stopped pacing. You're not actually going to report this. It wasn't a question. It was disbelief. The same disbelief men like Jason always have when the consequences they've ignored for years finally start becoming real. I already have, I said. That was only partially true. The bank investigation had begun. My attorney had the documentation. The rest would unfold naturally. Jason stared at me, searching my face for hesitation. He didn't find any. You're unbelievable, he said quietly. Maybe, I replied. Then I walked upstairs. I packed one suitcase. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just efficiently.
Clothes.
Laptop. Documents. The silver compass charm. Jason followed me halfway through.
You're not leaving, he said.
It wasn't a request. I turned toward him. You try to take out a loan in my name. That's not what I meant. You promised gambling money using my paycheck. That's not. You opened credit lines under my identity. Jason's voice rose. You're twisting everything. I held up the phone. Still recording. His mouth closed. For the first time since I'd known him, Jason looked unsure of his own words. I zipped the suitcase. Move, I said calmly. Jason stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. I walked past him, down the stairs and out the front door. The cool Nashville air felt different that night. Not dramatic. Just clear. I drove to a hotel downtown and slept for 9 uninterrupted hours. The next morning, the real work began. My attorney, an aggressive divorce lawyer recommended by a colleague, moved quickly. Fraud documentation. Financial separation. Asset protection. Every piece of evidence I had collected went into the legal file. Jason tried to fight back at first.
Mostly with threats.
He texted long messages about destroying my reputation, about telling everyone I was unstable, about exposing private arguments. But threats lose power when someone already expects them. So before Jason could start his version of the story, I sent a message of my own.
Short, clear, direct.
To friends, to colleagues, to the same social circle that had laughed at the engagement party. I explained the financial fraud, the investigation, the separation, and I attached 2 documents, the loan approval and the fraud inquiry letter. The silence that followed was immediate. Jason never launched his smear campaign because suddenly the facts existed publicly, and facts are very difficult to argue with. The divorce moved faster than he expected. Once Jason's lawyer realized the fraud investigation could become criminal, his tone changed quickly. Negotiations became quiet, practical. Jason agreed to the terms. 6 months later, it was finished. The house stayed with me. The debts stayed with him. But the final twist didn't come from the courtroom. It came from someone I barely knew. About 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received a message from Lena. She was the quiet wife from Jason's friend group, the only person at the rooftop dinner who hadn't laughed. Her message was short. I thought you should know something. Attached was a screenshot. A group chat between several of the men Jason used to spend time with. Scrolling through it felt like uncovering the last missing page of a story. Jason hadn't just borrowed money from me. He had borrowed from everyone. Small amounts. Hundreds here. 1,000 there. Always promising repayment after the next win. Most of them never saw the money again. Lena wrote one final line. You weren't the only one. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I closed the phone and set it aside. Because by then, Jason's collapse wasn't my responsibility anymore. A year later, my life looked very different. I had been promoted to lead physician for several ER rotations. The house felt quieter, peaceful. The mortgage was still mine, but now it actually felt like my home. Sometimes, late at night after a shift, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea and the silver compass charm resting in my hand, thinking about direction, thinking about choices. People often assume revenge is loud,
Dramatic.
explosive, but the truth is simpler. Jason's downfall wasn't something I created. It was the natural result of a man who believed love was a credit line. And when that credit finally closed, he discovered something too late. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself.